we're going to just go over some Shakespearean drama stuff, I guess, that you're going to need to know for the play. And that I think that this will help you before we even start the play to understand what's kind of going on with the way that Shakespeare wrote it. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the fact that this is a tragedy. Actually, Romeo and Juliet is kind of borderline both comedy and tragedy. It starts out as a comedy, but then obviously both of the main characters die, which makes it a tragedy. Some consider this actually to be Shakespeare's first romance, which was a new genre during his time. At the time that he was writing, there was really only tragedy and comedy. And basically, comedy didn't have to be funny, it just had to have a happy ending, whereas a tragedy could be funny but had to have a tragic ending. Although it doesn't mean that a tragedy was always funny. That definitely wasn't always the case. A lot of times they were pretty depressing. But usually tragedies are also a good vehicle for talking about more serious things than comedy was. So, Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy. It gives you this definition here in your text. I'm on the full text, by the way. Page 1026, if you want to check this out later. This tells you that a tragedy always ends in catastrophe, most often death for the main characters. This lets you know, though, that they offer more than just despair. They also include comic elements that counter the overall seriousness of the plot. So again, that idea that Shakespeare was really skirting the boundary between tragedy and comedy. He was trying new things that other playwrights hadn't ever tried before. So a tragedy always has a tragic hero, okay? So this is your central character, your protagonist. And this character usually dies, sometimes just fails at their accomplishments, and it's because of a big character flaw, or what you would call their tragic flaw, okay? It could also be a cruel twist of fate. You'll see in Romeo and Juliet that they do talk a lot about fate, but you can also look at possible tragic flaws in both Romeo and Juliet that lead to their ultimate demise. And then also usually a tragic hero has some kind of status. And I think this might have been because the common man considered their life to be maybe a tragedy anyway. The groundlings, the ones that are down here paying a penny to get in to see the show, whereas upper class or higher ranking person, they shouldn't have had to live a tragedy, right? They basically had everything that they could ever want. And so this shows that they're a tragic hero because they have this high rank, but they are unable to, have that happiness, I guess. It also says that it shows strength, that they show strength while facing their destiny. Okay, the antagonist, you guys are all familiar with this word, the force working against the protagonist. In Romeo and Juliet, you're going to hear a lot about fate. You could call fate one of the antagonists, but there are then also characters that are definitely antagonists as well. So think again to those conflicts that we talked about back when we talked about Most Dangerous Game. And know that there may be one main conflict, one main antagonist, but that the character could be working against multiple forces. Foils, lots of foils in Shakespeare. Remember that a protagonist and an antagonist are usually foils, but that characters who are on the same side can also be foils of one another. Think about best friends who are, one is a very extroverted person, and then the other best friend is an introverted person. They're foils of each other, but that opposite quality attracts, okay? And that this foil in writing, it tells you, highlights both characters' traits. For example, a timid character can make a talkative one seem even chattier, right? A soliloquy, this is a new word for you guys. A soliloquy is kind of like a monologue. The reason for soliloquies is because when you're watching a play, unlike a movie, you don't ever get to hear the character's inner thoughts. In a movie, a lot of times they'll do kind of like voiceover type situations and you get to hear what the character is thinking. But in a play, that can't happen. And so, what could happen in a soliloquy on the stage is the stage could be filled with other characters. And then all of a sudden, the character who's going to give the soliloquy turns aside, looks at the audience, acknowledges that the audience is there, and all the rest of the characters pretend like they can't hear what the character is about to say. And the character gives this speech to the rest of the audience. Now, sometimes it does happen when they are alone on stage, but sometimes they are accompanied by other characters, and those other characters are just pretending like they can't hear that soliloquy, okay? And that soliloquy is the inner thought. A lot of times it exposes a struggle, an inner struggle. An aside is similar to this, but then much shorter. So it says it's a character's remark either to the audience or to another character that others on the stage do not hear. This also reveals characters' private thoughts. So two very similar definitions here. Just know that a soliloquy is a speech and is usually much longer than an aside. An aside might just be a couple of lines. Like think of if somebody says something and then you try to say something smart under your breath that hopefully nobody hears. That's kind of like an aside. Dramatic irony. Gosh, I shouldn't even have to tell you guys this. You should already know it, but remember that it's when the audience knows something that the characters do not. Definitely some dramatic irony in this play. There's also a lot of verbal irony, which we're going to get to in a minute. It has a lot to do with comic relief. So humorous scene or speech intended to lighten the mood. You'll see the very first scene that we're going to read is a fight scene, but there's lots of witty conversation going on, but witty dialogue going on between the characters. Lots of verbal irony as well. And then it also tells you that the comic relief, basically because it's relieving all that seriousness, then it helps heighten the seriousness or the suspense of the main action because it provides contrast. Okay, so we're going to scroll down here, and this is just giving you a couple little models here. So the first one is just the character in a tragedy. Romeo is your protagonist. And in these lines, his cousin, Benvolio, is his foil, okay? Benvolio's like, good morning, cousin, or good morrow, cousin, because, you know, they're speaking in Middle English. And Romeo's like, is the day so young? But new struck 9. Ay me, sad hours seem long. Was that my father that went hence so fast? Then Benvolio says, it was. What sadness lengthens Romeo's hours? And then Romeo, very melodramatic here. Not having that which makes them short. Benvolio, in love, out. Benvolio, of love, out of her favor where I am in love. So basically he reveals that somebody doesn't love him as much as he loves her, right? Which is what it says over here. And so we have this, he's this tragic character already. We can already tell. Benvolio's like, he's real light, he's pretty optimistic. And Romeo is kind of got this like emo chip on his shoulder, kind of. So he's really down. He's got a possible weakness here. He is maybe falling a bit too head over heels in love with the wrong people. And so that's revealed in the very first scene that we're going to read. Here's a soliloquy. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you see that it's quite long. Okay, and this isn't even the entire speech. And this is usually revealing a lot about the character. Like I said, inner thoughts, inner conflict, right? Can also convey the mood of the scene. And so we'll get to that later. I don't want to get too far into the play. This is Act 3, Scene 2. So we don't really want to discuss this too much yet. But you can see the length of it. So we're getting into the language of Shakespeare here. Shakespeare always wrote in iambic pentameter, okay? That means that there are 10 syllables on every line, and 5 of them are unstressed and 5 of them are stressed, and it goes every other one, okay? At least that's the way iambic pentameter is supposed to work. Shakespeare liked to break rules, so he doesn't always follow it exactly, okay? But we did talk about how words like this over here, air, and or, like how he got rid of letters in order to fit the word into his iambic pentameter. And this just gives you an example, okay? So the little like U shape is an unstressed syllable and the little accent shape is a stressed syllable. So you're supposed to read that. You tell me not, for I have heard it all. Here's much to do with hate, but more with love. And so you can see that the words, even that are influenced, you have much, do, hate, more, love. Those are all stressed words, right? Tell not, I heard all. So he's even working with words here, so that you can tell which ones are supposed to be stressed when you read it. I always tell students not to worry too much about this. Try to read it like you would just a sentence, because if you try too hard to read this in this specific rhythm, then you don't even understand what you're reading because you're paying more attention to how you say it than what you're actually saying. Allusion is a reference within a work. We've already talked about this to something that the audience is expected to know. So Shakespeare's audience was pretty familiar already with Greek and Roman mythology. They would have even been very familiar with Greek tragedy. In 10th grade, we read a play called Antigone, and one of the scenes in Antigone is very, very similar to Romeo and Juliet. And Shakespeare knew that his audience would have known the play Antigone. Is a very old play from ancient Greece written by Sophocles. And then also he makes a lot of references to Venus, the Roman goddess of love. He also has those prologues, like the one that you have to memorize. And that's an example of Greek theater as well. So these are all allusions to ancient Greece that his audience would have known. All right, and then the very last thing that we're going to talk about is that comic relief by way of clever puns or jokes that result from multiple word meanings or rhyming sounds. That definition's right there. Sorry. And it gives you this example. In Act 1, a depressed Romeo puns on two meanings of the word light when he offers to carry a torch. Being but heavy, I will bear the light. Okay, so heavy, like it's heavy, right? Also, his heart is heavy because he's out of love, right? And then also light, like unactual light, or something that's very that doesn't weigh very much. So he's punning on these two words, and you're expected to remember that both of these words have two different meanings. And so that brings a little bit of comic relief, especially because he's so melodramatic. So here's just an example of blank verse. I'm not going to read through all that, but you can look at how that's all emphasized. And then here's another example of allusion and wordplay. I love this one right here. They're getting ready to go to a party in scene 4, and he says, "Not I, believe me, you have dancing shoes with nimble soles. I have a soul of lead, so stakes me to the ground, I cannot move." So shoes have soles, right? And then also, like, his heart is his soul, or his, like his love and all of that. And so souls and soul being in the shoes and also in the mind or the heart, whatever you want to say. It's a play on words there because they sound exactly the same, but obviously talking about two very different meanings. And remember that the audience is not looking at how these words are spelled. They're only hearing the words, and so they're catching that pun, that play on words. Verbal irony, remember that. And that's it. I think we'll stop there, and we'll be ready to read Act 1, Scene 1 and 2.